Hello everyone, welcome to the 70th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this video, I'd like to revisit the concept of death and what it actually is, according to my latest videos. So I encourage you to watch the 3 previous videos if you haven't watched them, because I'll be redrawing certain and revisiting certain ideas that I've explored there in more depth. Interfaces and dimensions, and all of these are kind of linked. It's another way of also explaining 5D and all these things. So let's get right to it. First of all, death. In the previous videos, I explained that basically our consciousness is a mixture or a blend of 2 different types of consciousnesses. One consciousness which is from infinity and everything, that goes through certain levels of consciousness, which you can call dimensions. For instance, you could say 9D or whatever, but I prefer to label them as by simply something like a multiverse, a conscious multiverse, conscious universe, conscious galaxy, conscious solar system. And here you have, going from, and it basically goes, that infinite consciousness goes through all of those layers and lands into the human consciousness, and then it is experienced through the lens of your brain and your own consciousness as a human being. So it's a descending kind of pattern. And then from nothingness, then you have the photon. Well, first you have just the wave, sound, photon. Then you have molecules, atoms, molecules, living cells. And the consciousness going from nothing, that also goes through your filter, your consciousness. And there's a kind of a blend between those two. And that is where your reality sits, between 0 and infinity, through the filter of the human mind. And that is how also, where you have basically, these are your past lives here somewhere, these are your future lives. And like I said, the universe works as a kind of a neural network where all of this is kind of interlinked at every single slice or moment of an eternal present. And everything, of course, impacts everything else. But here I wanted to revisit the concept of death. What really happens when this body dies? Well, those 2 consciousnesses now have to separate. One of the consciousnesses simply retracts back to your living cells, because your cells don't actually die. It is the coherence between them that dies, your body. But your individual cells still have a life of their own. And so one consciousness basically comes back to the level of your cells, and they have then a life of their own little experience, where some of them die, others live. They transform into other things, they interact with other cells, but they're no longer held together by this body, which is like a sort of a collective consciousness which holds them together. And the other part of your consciousness goes back this way. And that's what people experience as astral, in near-death experiences. It's basically, you are experiencing as a human, because you won't really go back to experiencing the parts that you're made of. Well, first of all, because that would be experiencing tens of billions of individual consciousnesses at once, which would be really weird. But rather, you will move towards the higher level. Your consciousness will detach, and you will identify with the higher level consciousness that is nearer towards infinity. And so that's why most people see this as going back into paradise, because ultimately it's as if when a cell dies in our body, it goes back to something higher than itself, like the human, and it feeds that kind of consciousness. And that's really strange for me to say, because I didn't even plan to say that. Why did I say that? Strange. Okay, that's a sort of a stroke of inspiration. But um, once every lower layer of consciousness dies, it separates again. It splits into two, and it goes into one part goes into the lower consciousness, and there it feeds it. It gives it the experience, the accumulated experience from a higher vantage point that'll help that consciousness then evolve. So when a cell dies, basically, it's as if the it some the consciousness is detached and go back into identifying as individual amino acids, proteins, and all that stuff. But they've still learned from the experience of being in that living cell, and they can sort of benefit all the all of the lower layers that they're a part of that experience. And part of that consciousness of the living cell also feeds the higher level consciousness, which is the global organisms, animals, plants. And you can see that everything sort of feeds everything else in what you call death, which isn't really death, it's just the end of the vehicle, which is at the intersection between two consciousness levels, one going from infinity to it and one going from nothing to it. And once that vehicle dies, then the consciousness splits in two. And as a human, we'll identify with whatever will go towards infinity, and then we'll live that as an expansion of our consciousness, as being more aware, as being woken up from a dream, which was the body. Um, so I hope that makes it a little clear. This death, it's not really death, it's just consciousness splitting in two, basically. So it's only life. Actually, there's only life all the time. Because your consciousness never dies, it just splits in two. That's what death is you could actually say, oops, life split, or consciousness splitting. Consciousness split. That's what death is. You split your consciousness. Now, interfaces and dimensions. This is really important. I just heard a very interesting channel from Yara. I really invite you to check out her channeling. She's really a great channeler. I really like her channelings. And she's saying that the 5D is creating the new Earth, so to speak, from our heart space. Now, our heart space, I identify that as creating from a harmonious place where the rules for a harmonious interaction between all humans are fully integrated into our way of functioning, which means you will naturally manifest what is best for all. Just like your cells, when they're manifesting and being part of your body, they are doing the action which is in the interest of the entire body, not of just themselves. And and this is always this kind of mystery. What is the cutoff points between different dimensions? Or what I prefer to call them is interfaces also. And I asked one of my friends, for instance, what happens in what kind of world or dimension does a living cell sort of find itself when the different parts that it is made of sort of assemble and lock into place to form a coherent whole. What is that outside world? And my friend said, well, it's the world we see. It's 3D, of course. But it's strange. Where was that world when that cell was just its constitutive parts, independent of each other? Was it in 2D? Was it in another world, another dimension? Or was it in the same world? And of course, it's really difficult to sort of think about this because our interface, our dimension, which is 3D, is more than 2 billion years old. Because you could say that it has been sort of refined and stabilized by the collective experience of all the life that has lived this planet for the last 2 billion years. And it was shaped and refined like a computer program or interface that had billions and billions and billions of upgrades and versions until it reaches a point where it's ready to transition to another level altogether. And so here's the more interesting question. Imagine if you would link up every single human being's brain, and this is just a thought experiment, like just take the brain of every human and you link them up with a cable. And every human is linked with other human, like basically you interconnect the brains in a neural network fashion. And let's say that now, basically, it would be somewhere here, like basically a collective global organism made of human beings as a neural network. What? So let's say that now has a consciousness of its own. It develops a consciousness of its own, just like we have a consciousness of our own. We're not just the collective will of ourselves, even though we are influenced by that, of course, because, of course, when our cells are unhappy about something, we receive commands and information in the form of pain, disease, and plenty of other things, which prompt us to act in a certain way, like get food, do more exercise, or whatever. But still, we consider that we have a consciousness of our own. And when we have to qualify that consciousness, we don't feel as if they're 10,000 billion individual consciousnesses which somehow merge into one. We feel like one consciousness, like there's this one consciousness that is united within us. Of course, you could say, well, of course, and I have different personalities, different this, different that, but still, I mean, except for people that are schizophrenic, you still experience as this one continuous sort of consciousness that flows through you. So the question is, what interface, what dimension, or what world would that being, like imagine it has some like virtual eyes here, what world, what outside reality would this being made of us as its cells or as its neurons, if you could say, what reality would that being experience? Now that is the real puzzle. Where would it find itself? And the answer to that question in my mind is something like the astral or the spiritual or whatever. I don't really know how to answer, but definitely 5D. That is what 5D is in my mind. Because while the experience from the vantage point of the living cell changes once it locks into place, and once all the elements sort of lock into place and interact in a harmonious way, the outside experience of that living cell as one unit of consciousness, as a single consciousness, completely changes. It is in a world of its own. The individual experience of its parts is also completely transformed compared to the same elements but separated. So The 5D is a, how should I say, a mix, again, a blend between two consciousness levels going from, again, zero to infinity. And simply speaking, if you let that consciousness flow through your heart space, then it goes all the way here instead of going here. And now you become a part of this global collective consciousness, and you identify with that, and your experience is completely different. You become one cell amongst other cells, just like your cells are a part of your body, and your experience is completely transformed compared to humans that actually live right next to your dimension, like right next to you, just like there are individual living cells in the room where you are right now, like on your desk, you have plenty of life, tiny little living cells there, totally unaware of your experience, totally oblivious to what you're living, and they're right there, right on your, sitting on your desk. While your cells in your body are living a transcendental experience, like just completely different from the individual experience of the separated living cells that are not part of a global organism. Just you, for instance, going from your desk to your room is like the equivalent of us going from Earth to Jupiter, compared to, like, basically for what those little single-celled organisms that are living on your desk experience compared to your experience and the experience of your cells. So 5D is this process basically of um, changing the interface, and a two-way process where our collective unconscious becomes a collective conscious, and um, it's basically just transitioning into a whole new reality, um, simply because of this interaction and forming a global organism, and because of this process of, um, once you lock in to a new kind of form, you're bound to create a completely different experience than the separated elements. You're in a completely different reality. And that reality is extremely stable from our point of view because we've sort of treaded it for 2 billion years. The interface we're going to be projected in from our point of view is going to be completely insane and nuts and magical, because it'll be really fresh, just like what a baby probably experiences as it's born for the first few years, before it becomes like sort of, like adults, basically, like children um, are excited about just about anything, be it snow, be it flowers, the sun, the clouds, and everything. And after a certain period of time, they sort of say like, "This gets old," and they become adults, and nothing is magical anymore. Well, from our vantage point as single cells in this global kind of being, it will be an absolutely insane experience normally. And again, death will be the same again from our vantage point. A separation here where one part goes back to individual humans and the other part goes upwards still. And again, sort of cross fertilizing um, the experience for the universe to learn and evolve. So perhaps reincarnations and the star seeds and all of those things are souls that have been part of a collective global organism on the Pleiades or whatever, and their souls, as they sort of decompose, their consciousness as it decomposes, lands back into individual cells, which is us. Like, for instance, when you're you live an experience of your own, like you're born to your mother or something. It's like a cell. Once you die, it's as if it was reborn because it's no longer part of the global organism, and the conscious sort of um, its individual consciousness and its sense of individuality is reinstated, and it's as if it were born again in a new reality, which is your dead body, basically. So, okay, in a very poetic sense, or not so poetic sense, we may be, as humans, when we start our life as individual consciousnesses, it may be actually the due to the death of a body of a global organism made up of us as its parts. And then we resume our life, or we start our life, we think we start our life when that global organism dies. Now, of course, I didn't even plan to say this. It's just something that came to me right now. So um, just take it as an interesting thought experiment, and I'd be happy to hear your take on this idea. And don't hesitate to leave comments or ask questions if you have any. I hope this was an interesting video, and talk to you next time.